It's nice to see you, Robert. I know you got a lot going on now, so we don't have to visit, but nice
Right.
to
Well,
see
we're
you.
breaking up the time. We're kind of waiting anyway. So, it's
It's
might as well.
loading, Robert. We're close.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Why don't you-
Okay. So we're live now.
No, no,
Correct.
no.
Oh,
Robert,
good. Let me know when we go live. You're going to chat me up, right? Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the annual CCNMA Latino Journalists of Southern California Ruben Salazar Awards. These are annual awards that recognize journalism as it relates to reporting on issues affecting the Latino community across the United States. We have a lot of candidates and finalists today, and we also have another conversation after this. So please stay tuned with us for a morning of interesting and enlightening events. More than 5 decades ago, thousands of Chicanos and their supporters gathered on the streets of East Los Angeles for the National Chicano Moratorium against the Vietnam War. It was August 29th, 1970. It was a peaceful protest that was calling attention to social inequities, injustice, and the war in Vietnam, where Latinos were dying in large numbers. But before day's end, violence would break out and 3 people would die. One of them was Los Angeles Times columnist and KMEX TV news director, Ruben Salazar. I am honored today to have 2 trailblazing journalists who were there that day on August 29th and witnessed events as they unfolded and covered events in the aftermath of the slaying of Salazar and the investigation that was supposed to uncover what happened that day. Was he targeted because of his hard-hitting reporting in LA's Mexican-American communities? Or was he in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply the victim of a tragic accident? To help us unravel some of that and talk about what they saw that day and their recollections are Joe Raso. Joe was an editor with La Raza magazine. La Raza was out shooting photographs, reporting news stories that the mainstream media had largely ignored. They were covering the east side of Los Angeles, the turbulence, the events, the protests, and the stories of people from the community who were giving back and contributing to the betterment of Latinos on the east side. Jesus Salvador Trevino is a noted filmmaker and director, but a lot of people don't know he was also a journalist. He was a producer and reporter for KQED television in Los Angeles back in 1970, and he was there that day at the Chicano Moratorium, and he covered the coroner's inquest that was supposed to investigate the slaying of Ruben Salazar, and we'll be talking about all that. Gentlemen, on behalf of CCNMA, thank you very much for taking your time today to join us. And I really do appreciate you being here. And I know our audience appreciates that as well. So a hearty round of applause virtually for both of you. Y muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Jesus, a lot of people don't really know what it was like back then in the months leading up to the moratorium on the east side of Los Angeles. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, especially the relations between the community and the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles Sheriffs?
Well, ever since the walkouts, I think the walkouts were seminal events in our community because it showed that we had a community of activists and that people had had enough of all the injustices and that they were going to do something about it. And I think while police had always been present in our communities in a confrontational way for generations. I mean, you go back to the 1950s and bloody Christmas, where police went into the jails of Los Angeles and beat up people. They had this long history. And it became exacerbated during the walkouts where police were there arresting young people who were exercising their right for freedom of expression. And at that time, there was certainly a lot of confrontational relationships between the community at large and both the sheriff's department and the LAPD. And it's important to separate the two because although they worked in cohorts often, they were two different entities. Perhaps the most important event prior to the moratorium in relation to police and community was the killing in July of 1970 of two Mexican brothers at a Flophouse Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. 5 police officers and 2 detectives from the San Leandro police force had zeroed in on an apartment which they thought had a suspect they were looking for, and they got the wrong apartment. And they burst into the room, and there were 5 or 6 people in there. This is one of these flop houses where 5 or 6 undocumented men would live together just to share expenses. And they broke in and they started shooting up the place. And there were 2 brothers that tried to escape because they're sitting there in their living room and people coming in with guns. And they were both shot and killed. And this became a really an important cause célèbre at the time. And Ruben Salazar, saw all of this and decided he was going to do some investigative reporting about the relationship between the police and the community and what the police were doing in terms of monitoring the activities of Mexican Americans and Mexicans. And it got to the point where the chief of police of Los Angeles, Ed Davis, wrote to the editor of Ruben Salazar's Los Angeles Times. At the time, Ruben Salazar was working for Los Angeles Times as a columnist, and he told his boss, "You got to fire Salazar." So this is the context in which Salazar is being monitored. He's very ever present in the radar of both the sheriffs and the police. And
it's an interesting point that you raised because Salazar also wrote a column in which he talked about police visiting him at the KMEX station in the aftermath of this shooting and saying that he was inflaming tensions and that, quote, this information was dangerous in the minds of barrio people, close quote. And so you're absolutely right. Police were really upset. And Joe, you attended a meeting, didn't you, in which there was LAPD representatives and management from the LA Times, and Salazar was discussed. Were you there?
Yes, I was invited to the meeting by Father Luz. Risco, who was the editor of the La Raza at that time, was also invited, along with Reverend Antonio Hernandez, who was in charge of an organization called the Mexican American Community Programs Foundation, which worked with nonprofit organizations trying to organize the community. Father Luz and Father Woods, who was a lawyer, were both pastors from the Church of the Epiphany in Lincoln Heights. And I believe Esteban Torres was also there, who was from Telacu and later on became a congressman. We were invited to represent the community. And at that meeting with the LAPD and Times Management, the focus was on Ruben Salazar. And they wanted the community to disown Ruben Salazar because they felt that he was a provocateur, that he was agitating rather than just covering the news stories that were occurring in our community. We disagreed and indicated to him that Ruben had no role whatsoever in planning or in the strategy of the demonstrations, that he was just reporting the facts rather than participation. And I would like to read a statement to you, and that is very apropos for today's times. And this was said by Malcolm X more than 50 years ago. The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's the power because they control the minds of the masses. The press is so powerful in its image-making role that it can make the criminal look like he's the victim and the victim look like he's the criminal. If you aren't careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And obviously, we've seen this with the last 4 years with the Trump administration being in charge, that many times facts are distorted and they become propaganda for their point of view. And Ruben worked in this area. Unfortunately, Ruben was one of the very few media representatives that we had, other than maybe Moreno from KCET. And he not only represented the community, but in doing so and reporting the facts, he became a target. And the police were definitely after him.
Did you notice any of that, Jesus, in the weeks and months leading up to the August 29 moratorium?
Well, I don't know that I personally saw, the surveilling of Salazar, but I agree with Joe that he was certainly on their radar, and even to the point where during the course of the inquest that followed his death, I remember Guillermo Restrepo recounting that while they were walking on Whittier Boulevard, Salazar said, "Boy, I'm being really stupid." And that was because there were so many sheriffs around, and he was so visible and such a likely target.
And Guillermo Restrepo was a reporter who worked for Salazar at KMEX TV at the time, right?
Yes, he was a photographer.
The morning of the moratorium, thousands of people are gathering. I believe it was near Belvedere Park by the East LA Sheriff Station. Were either of you there as this was going down? And you recall the events that morning, either there or along the route? Because as I recall, the marchers marched from the park area to Laguna Park, which is now named Salazar Park in East Los Angeles, which is very close to the LA city line. And as you mentioned, Jesus, for people who don't know, LAPD covered LA City on the east side, which was like Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, that area. But once you crossed Indiana into unincorporated East Los Angeles, it was the sheriffs, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That was Indiana was the demarcation line.
Right. So what do you guys recall that morning and that early in the afternoon at the moratorium?
I had parked my car near the Sears substation, which becomes important a little later. And I walked through the whole march filming, and we wound up down at the park. And at the conclusion of the march, it was really a kind of a festive feeling there. There was, ballet folklorico and speakers, and everyone was laid out on the lawn in groups, families with children and elderly people. And it was really kind of I thought, boy, this is going to be another one of those boring afternoons in the park, And I had to get my equipment back to. I had parked. A friend of mine had driven his car to the park, so we'd have a place where we could take our equipment and then go back to the original starting point where I had parked my car. And so we said, well, let's take our equipment and go back and transfer the equipment. He had to go on to some other event, and then I was going to come back to the park. And my then wife, Gayla, was with me, and we went back. And as we were unloading the equipment from our car, from our friend's car into our car, all of a sudden, here come down this, right at the East LA substation, here come one car after another. I counted over 35 cars with police, sheriffs in their bulky gear with face masks. I could see shotguns whizzing by us to the point where I had to go up against my car so I wouldn't get hit. And I knew something was up. And I immediately jumped back in the car. We went back to Laguna Park, and I was able to arrive there and start filming the remnants of the initial attack, because the attack was still going on and the police were still beating on people's heads. And I started filming some of that until one of a plainclothes cop came by and shoved me to the ground and was going to start coming after me. And I had my camera equipment, which is on loan. And it was like an expensive piece of equipment. And I just, took it away and just cowered. And he took off after someone else. And that's when I said, I got to get out of here, because this equipment is going to go away real quick. But that was my memory of what was going on then.
And the sheriff's deputies also called in LAPD for backup, and they basically attacked a peaceful crowd. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think you see it in the footage that was later incorporated in the film Requiem 29.
Yeah, that's some brutal footage in there.
You see the phalanx of police officers and sheriffs just marching into the crowd and shooting their tear gas and just literally attacking. And of course the crowd responded in a human way, which was some people started running, and some of the younger men started going to the forefront to defend the women and children that were behind them from the police.
So all hell breaks out at Laguna Park, which is on Whittier Boulevard. People start going down Whittier Boulevard. Where are you at, Joe, when this is all going down?
I'm at Laguna Park, and the allegations were that some of the marchers were looting a liquor store, which was about a block and a half away from Laguna Park. Instead of, and the owner alleges that he never called the police, that the police just showed up and started beating people. Instead of moving that small crowd of people that were in the liquor store westward, away from the park, they drove them straight into the park. And to me, this was just an excuse to break up the Chicano Moratorium gathering, which almost was 20,000 people that paraded that time. We also had a bunch of dancers, small girls that were from Busca, a community organization, and were dancing for the crowd. When they came in, they fired tear gas. We had a whole bunch of monitors, and the monitors were primarily clergy and older adults that intervened and spoke to the police and said, we'll handle it, we'll handle it. The police just shoved them aside, struck them, and went on striking people. We have film of numerous women and men being struck. Some of the younger crowd, as Jesus mentioned, then started breaking up some of the road barriers and some of the bleachers and arming themselves with wood and using them as batons to protect themselves against the sheriff.
People go east. Salazar and Restrepo are working their way east and end up at the Silver Dollar Bar. You're there, Joe, right? When
yes,
sheriff's deputies swoop down, what happens? Well, Jesus, you've sort of followed this a bit. Before we get back to Joe, can you tell us what precipitated this? Salazar and Restrepo stop in the bar to use the restroom. They decide to grab a quick beer, and then history takes a tragic course.
Well, this is the report of one of the people who was there at the corner of Laverne and Whittier Boulevard, the so-called man in red vest. And he testifies that he saw two individuals, one with a rifle and one with a handgun, go into the Silver Dollar Bar. He makes no mention of Ruben Salazar or Restrepo or any of the people that were with him. And he tells this to one of the sheriffs, Sheriff Grazer. And according to Grazer's testimony at the inquest, he called up the other sheriffs locally on his car-to-car, patrol car to patrol car frequency number one, and they all swooped down on the Silver Dollar Bar. So the surrounding of the Silver Dollar Bar and the shooting of the tear gas into the bar and the death of Salazar all were precipitated by this one individual who said that he had saw people with guns going in there. Curiously enough, individuals with rifles were never found inside the bar. The man testified later that he never saw those people come out of the bar. So who knows what happened to them, if they were there at all. The only other person who testifies to the fact that there may have been people there with guns was the owner of the record shop across the street from the Silver Dollar, who testified that earlier that he had seen two men with a rifle down the street, but he never testified they went into the Silver Dollar bar. So again, all of this, that the whole evening of events that Joe was party to and photographed so eloquently, all rested on this one testimony.
And Joe, you're outside the bar with another photographer, Raul Reis, correct, when this all goes down?
That's correct. We left Laguna Park.
And
when
here's
it
a
was
photo that
declared-
Raul took, right? You see that
Right.
photo?
When it was declared an unlawful assembly, we saw a gathering of police cars in front of the bar, on the side, and in back of the bar. There were quite a few police there. And patrons, when they were pointing the guns at them, and this is prior to the deputy that fired the tear gas canister was there. They were pushing people back into the bar. If there indeed was an individual with a rifle in the bar, then they should not be pushing people and endangering them by pushing them back into the bar. In addition to that, there was a curtain, a dark curtain in front of the doorway of the bar. And so shortly thereafter, the individual with the tear gas weapon came in and fired into the bar. How you can fire a weapon into a bar without knowing who's behind the curtain is unknown to me. I mean, it was definitely gross negligence or reckless disregard of the lives of the people inside the bar.
So basically no gun or no evidence of anyone carrying a gun has ever proven to be true. Jesus, as you say, a deputy fires a projectile into that bar, and what happens? It hits Ruben Salazar, and there's some controversy that followed that, right? In terms of the bar and the scene, the crime scene that it now becomes.
Yeah, what happens is Sheriff Tom Wilson shoots the fateful flight right projectile into the bar, and the bar begins to fill with gas, and then he turns and they fire another tear gas into the street, and they start to disperse the crowd. And then once the crowd is dispersed, they get into their cars. This is according to their testimony to Sheriff Grazer and Wilson. And they get into their cars because they're called away to McDonald and Whittier to some other disturbance, and they leave the place, and the door is closed. Now, they come back a half hour or so later. What's curious is that there is testimony from a couple of people, one of them, Chavez, who was hiding between cars when the crowd was dispersed, and he testifies that one of the officers went into after they had shot in the fateful tear gas, and after they had dispersed the crowd, clearing the area of any eyewitnesses, I might comment, then one of them went into the bar, came back out coughing because of the gas, pointed to the floor of the bar, got into an argument with two more officers. They argued for some time. He kept pointing down to the floor of the bar, and then they slammed the door shut and they got into their cars and they left. That is testimony that was recorded and given at the Salazar inquest. No one made anything of it afterwards. And to this day, I am dumbfounded that, were this today, in today's, after the Floyd event and the footage we've seen of police activity, were it happening today, and we would have a photo, as we just saw, of the guilty party shooting into the bar and killing Salazar, there would have been a huge investigation. There would have been indictments at least. But none of that happened. Why? Because of the character of the inquest. We can talk about that later.
Yes. So let me understand this. Salazar's body just sits there for hours. Is that accurate?
Yes. Sometime between 5 and 5:30 is when the thing went in, when he was shot. Then, curiously enough, it isn't until after 7 o'clock that someone goes into the bar and, quote, discovers the body. Who is that person? Coincidentally, it is the head PR guy for the sheriffs, the head of the public relations department of the Los Angeles County Sheriffs, just happens to be going to the bar and just happens to discover the body. Isn't that coincidence?
And my understanding is that witnesses, Guillermo Restrepo among them, who came out of the bar, crawled out of the back, and Salazar's boss at KMEX at the time, Danny Villanueva, they were making calls and they were asking the sheriff's department, what's going on? Ruben's inside the bar. I mean, so there are indications that authorities outside of that scene knew this was going down. Is that accurate?
Yes. Danny Villanueva, the next morning, I attended the press conference that Danny Villanueva was at, and he testified that he called more than 12 times between 5 and 10 p.m., telling them that there was someone in the bar, that Salazar was still in the bar, and he received no response from the sheriffs. There is testimony from a woman that saw an ambulance pull up in front of the Silver Dollar about half an hour after the firing went and after the police had left. Most of the police had left. And one of the officers who was still on the scene came up to the driver of the ambulance and ushered him away, told him to go away, and the ambulance took off. So evidently someone had called to that location for an ambulance, and it was ushered away.
Joe.
And again, it wasn't until after 7 that the body was officially discovered.
Wow. Joe, how long were you there after the flight right?
Well, we were there
was filed.
We were there for about an hour, doing some filming, and then we left. And I called Raul that night when I had learned through the media that Ruben's body had been discovered. And I told Raul, we have photos of the Silver Dollar. And Raul said, no, we were at a different bar. And so I asked Raul to meet me at La Raza that morning, and we developed the various rolls of film that we had. And indeed, we had covered the event. And that's when we decided we need to do an exclusive on the death of Ruben Salazar. What happened later on was that after we came out with our newspaper, or prior to that, Sal Castro had learned through Raul that we had copies, or that we had the film. And so he brought Tom Broadcall from Channel 4. He was with the local Channel 4 at that time, and he asked for copies. We agreed to give him copies after we published our newspaper. But the very same night that we agreed, the editor from Channel 4 made an editorial statement that night, basically saying that the people that were marching were the cause of the riot and that they were thugs on Whittier Boulevard starting the fire. So as a result, I refused to give them copies of our film. And about a week later, Raul provided copies to the LA Times, which the LA Times has now.
I'm going to share a headline here from the LA Times. Joe and Jesus. Joe just brings up an interesting point. The term riot. Can you guys see this headline?
Yeah.
Yes.
1 dead, 40 hurt in East LA riot. It seems to me, based on all the investigation that I've done after the fact, that there was a lot of emphasis on the riot, this so-called riot, and yet there was not as much emphasis put on what happened and how did Ruben Salazar die. And I guess that was the purpose of why we were supposed to have a coroner's inquest. Is that accurate to say, Jesus?
Yes, the inquest, the point of the inquest was really to chill the community out. We'd seen this terrible day of 500 fires set, hundreds of people arrested, and the authorities wanted to put a lid on everything. And so they got together with a group of Mexican American leaders, reverends and others, and they said, look, we're going to have an inquest. The point of the inquest ostensibly was to discover the death of Ruben Salazar. What were the facts, the details, how was he killed? In point of fact, after the first 2 days of the testimony were nothing but aligned in such a way that scheduled, if you will, that the police, the sheriffs were there reporting first, and they were showing video that the police had taken of any instance they possibly could find of someone throwing a rock or someone breaking a police car window, anything they could provide to establish the mood of a riot about to happen. And that was the chilling fact. And it got to be so preposterous that at the end of the first, I think the first or the second day, the whole committee, the community committee, got up and left in disgust because they could see they were being used to depict their community as a bunch of rioters, and that because of that, the police were justified in their response and therefore justified in the killing of Salazar, the accidental killing of Salazar. But this was all just the way in which the inquest was being manipulated to indict the community and create an atmosphere that the police were only doing their job.
And an inquest, for those who don't know, is a sort of a quasi-judicial proceeding, correct? In which you call in witnesses, they give testimony. And this was an unprecedented event for LA. Wasn't this broadcast live and rotated by TV stations at the time?
Yes, this was way before OJ. This was a televised inquest, gavel to gavel, and all the television stations in Los Angeles pooled their resource. So one day, the crew of one station would be filming, and the next day, the crew of another station would be filming. But all the stations had access to it. I was working for KCET, and KCET was carrying it live through the whole day. And my job was I sat in the courtroom that day, every day, and took notes. And then I would go back to the station. I would pull clips from the video that had been recorded of that day's proceedings and put together a narrative that told about what the proceedings had been that day. And then we would have a discussion, usually with community leaders, about the impact and import of this. And we had an attorney with us, a USC professor of law, Howard Miller, who would also participate with me. He was my co-host on air, and he would give us the legal end of it. What did the legalities of it mean? But the point of it was that at the end of the inquest, there was no certainty and no need for anyone to indict anyone or any kind of further proceedings to ensue. And that was why it looked like a trial. It looked like we were going to get facts. But in point of fact, if they had found that someone, which they did, had shot someone and had photos of it, they didn't have to do anything about that.
And one of the things that amazes me is that the sheriffs refused to give up their manual on the tear gas operations and so we never got to the bottom of whether even this projectile, which in fact was really a small missile, a torpedo shaped missile with fins, was even supposed to have been used. Is that accurate?
Well, when I
Yes.
was at La Raza, one day I went back after the killing of Ruben Salazar. This was several weeks after, and one of my associate members indicated to me that someone had come in and had left a message for me with a manual in a brown manila envelope. When I opened it, it was the instructions for the use of that weapon. I was in the midst of writing a story on that, and I left that on my desk in La Raza. Unfortunately, during that morning, I had been in a confrontation with a gang member, an ex-con at La Raza. I didn't appreciate his behavior, so I had kicked him out along with some of my associates who helped me, and he wanted to fight. That night, I received a telephone call from the owner of the place that we were renting in City Terrace at La Raza, who indicated to me that a fire had started at La Raza in the small alleyway behind our office. When I went to La Raza, the sheriffs, the police, along with firemen were inside La Raza. Unfortunately, I lost access to that manual because they took it along with other equipment and material that we had, that we were working on various stories in La Raza. So we never really got to publish it. But the most important thing is not just the inquest, but the whole atmosphere during that time. Los Angeles City Hall, we had a liberal mayor, Yorty, that started and then turned conservative because he had Tom Bradley, a black man, who was running against him. We had the Catholic Church with Cardinal McIntyre, Monsignor Hawks, Bishop Ward, also very conservative people that were trying to disband the Immaculate Heart nuns because they were preaching liberation theology. The Board of Education was very conservative. Everywhere, the whole county was basically controlled by conservatives. So they were trying to put a lid on any tensions that developed in the community. And certainly the death of Ruben Salazar created a lot of tension.
And so here we stand today, 51 years later. We had this show, this inquest, never really got to the bottom of the killing, focuses instead primarily on the rioting. Sheriffs refused to talk about whether they should have even used that missile in that type of situation. Deputy says, I don't know what I used. I just fired it in. I wanted to get it in. Fire breaks out at La Raza. And coincidentally, the manual that might have shed some light on this and other records are taken away. Nothing's written because of that. So we're left with all these questions. Jesus and Joe, I want to know, what do you think? Was this a targeted killing? Did they try to silence Salazar? Or was this simply a series of unfortunate circumstances?
Well, let me just say this. I think there are several factors or several issues that remain questions that remain unanswered. One, the whole testimony of the man in red. Is that a legitimate testimony? Did he really see people going in there with guns? Were there anyone really going in there? Or was all this just a pretext to knowing that Salazar was inside the bar? Did some of the sheriffs who happened to be patrolling there decide, well, let's go in there and see what's going to happen? That is a bit open question. It can be solved because one of the things that at the time of the inquest, it was several of the officers said that they were unsure whether the conversations that were taking place on frequency 1 were ever recorded.
Frequency one being the sheriff's frequency, correct?
No, the frequency one being the patrol car to patrol car frequency.
Gotcha.
When the archives were made public of the Salazar inquest, made public by Sheriff Baca in 2012, I went there on the day that they were uncovered, and I held in my hand frequency one, the frequency that was not supposed to exist. I held a box of audio tape that said frequency one on it. I've since had it digitized, and I'm now cleaning up the digitization so I can listen to it, because it's after 50 years, it's a little garbled. I want to be able to go back to that and see if, in fact, there was an announcement from the man in the red vest that that these guys had gone in there with guns. And subsequently, when they left the Salazar bar, the pretext also was on frequency one, that they were going to go to attend to some other event down at McDonald and Whittier. Did that really happen? These are open questions. Also, the whole question of the ambulance showing up, the question of these officers, the testimony of people saying that they saw officers pointing to the ground in the Silver Dollar bar. If the officers knew that there was someone lying in there, why did they all take off? And why was his body not discovered until 2 hours later, conveniently, by the head of the public relations department, someone who would know how to handle all this information? These are all questions that need to be examined. And I welcome any of the journalists out there. You know, the information is still there. I just donated to USC a hard copy and a digitized format of the 2,000-page Salazar inquest. The entire inquest is now going to be housed at USC in special collections. And so it's there for people to peruse. And I challenge people to go back and see if there isn't something there that is worthy of further investigation.
Well, thank you. And you journalists in the audience, you heard it. Let's start digging into that. Joe, we've got about a minute or so left. Your final thoughts on all this?
Well, my final thoughts of, given the fact that an intelligence officer from the LAPD testified before Congress on the Internal Security Act in the Senate, which was a subcommittee of the Internal Affairs, and he testified about all the radicals, the New Left, and the subversion of the New Left infiltrating many organizations. And his testimony is readily available. It's about 60 pages. It named everyone that attended the meeting at the LA Times during the focus on Ruben Salazar's activities. Although Ruben wasn't named directly, it certainly has an impact on Ruben's activities.
Great.
And it's difficult to prove in terms of whether it's murder one, murder two. Certainly it was manslaughter, voluntary or involuntary. There are many elements in each one of those crimes, and it takes a criminal specialist to deal with those elements.
Well, thank you, Joe, for summing that up. Thank you, Jesus, for participating. And with both of you, CCNMA will be celebrating its 50th anniversary this coming year. We hope to have a number of events in person and see everybody there. And I'd love to sort of carry on this conversation further with both of you during the 50th anniversary. For those of you who are not CCNA members, go to ccnma.org, join, or give a gift. This organization has been around for 50 years, providing opportunities, thousands of dollars of scholarships to hundreds of students. And this panel is also being recorded on YouTube. You can watch it later. So if you or others didn't get a chance to see it or all of it, you can see it in its entirety on YouTube. And we've got a very good panel coming up next. CCNMA board member Luz Villarreal, a journalist, will be in conversation with filmmaker Philip Rodriguez about his Man in the Middle film about Ruben Salazar. And after that, we've got the Ruben Salazar Awards. So please stay with us. Gentlemen, thank you once again for being with us today. I appreciate you taking the time This was fascinating, and I hope that we have an opportunity to carry this conversation a little bit further in person during our anniversary year for CCNMA next year. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Robert, for doing a good job of moderating.
All right, Joe, and thank you, Jesus. I'll see you guys later, and we'll talk. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.